He was complaining. He was just completely out of control, disrupted, and that's not true. I was just trying to explain myself. We need to understand your perspective on what happened here today.
I was just trying to help, but things got out of hand.
At 10:14 on a Tuesday morning, a classroom door clicked shut, and a 16-year-old boy was quietly reclassified as a threat. Not because he shouted. Not because he moved. But because he didn't. He sat perfectly still, hands folded on his desk, while a story about chaos and danger was spoken into existence around him. This is not a story about a student losing control. It's about a child who understood that survival meant becoming invisible, calculating his breathing, freezing his body, letting fear speak for someone else. As police crossed the threshold expecting violence, they found silence. And in that gap, between what authority claimed and what reality showed, a camera began recording. What it captured would expose something far more dangerous than disorder. The ease with which fear becomes fact, and how quickly a boy can become a suspect simply for existing in the wrong body, in the wrong room, at the wrong moment. The heavy metal latch of the classroom door clicked, a sound that seemed to echo with the violence of a gunshot in the unnatural silence of the room. It was 10:14 on a Tuesday morning, the kind of mundane hour where the dust motes usually dance in the shafts of sunlight hitting the linoleum. But today the air was thick, pressurized, and waiting to break. In the center of the room sat 16-year-old Elijah, though in the official report filed 40 minutes later, he would not be described as a child or a student. He would be described as a threat, a suspect, and a chaotic element that required immediate law enforcement intervention. But if you looked at him in that frozen moment, before the heavy boots of the officers fully crossed the threshold, you would have seen a study in absolute, terrifying stillness. Elijah was not flipping desks. He was not screaming profanities. He was not hurling textbooks at the whiteboard. He was sitting with his hands folded on the laminate surface of his desk, his posture rigid, his breathing shallow and controlled. He had learned, through the unspoken curriculum taught to boys like him long before they enter a high school, that his movement was a weapon in the eyes of others. To move was to provoke. To stand was to threaten. And so he did the only thing he could to survive the narrative being spun around him. He turned himself into stone. Across the room, the teacher stood near the intercom, her chest heaving with a performance of fear that did not match the reality of the room. She was the author of the fiction that was currently summoning armed men to a place of learning. Her voice, when she had spoken to the dispatcher, trembled with descriptions of violence and loss of control, painting a picture of a rampaging beast that needed to be put down. The disconnect between her breathless report and the library-quiet atmosphere of the classroom was not just a lie, it was a hallucination of authority. It was the historical reflex of a system that sees danger in black silence just as much as it sees danger in black noise. The officer pushed the door open fully, his hand resting instinctively near his belt, his eyes scanning for the combatant he had been promised. The radio chatter in his ear had prepped him for a brawl, for a situation spiraling out of control, for a suspect who was non-compliant and combative. Instead, he found a boy wearing a hoodie and worn sneakers, staring at a geometry textbook as if it were the only anchor keeping him from floating away. The officer paused. The cognitive dissonance in that doorway was palpable. You could almost hear the gears of the institutional narrative grinding against the friction of the truth. The report said chaos. The eyes saw stillness. This represents the fundamental conflict we are going to explore today, the war between the story written on paper by those in power and the story captured in the indisputable frames of reality. For Elijah, staying seated was not an act of defiance, but an act of preservation. He knew that the moment he rose, he would validate the fear that had summoned the police. He knew that his physical size, his skin tone, and his gender had already convicted him in the mind of the educator standing by the door. She needed him to be out of control to justify her own lack of it. She needed him to be a villain so she could remain the victim. But Elijah refused to play the role. He sat there, letting the silence scream for him. This is the texture of modern tragedy, not a loud explosion, but a quiet room where a teenager has to calculate the velocity of his own breathing to avoid being handcuffed. The officer took a step forward, the floor wax squeaking under his tactical sole, and looked from the teacher to the boy. The teacher pointed a shaking finger, reaffirming her story, trying to bridge the gap between her fabrication and the peaceful scene before them. She spoke of aggression, of tone, of an attitude that felt threatening. She used the nebulous, subjective language that has historically been the padlock on the chains of the marginalized. But unbeknownst to her, and perhaps unbeknownst to the officer in that first 10-second, the entire interaction was not just disappearing into the ether of memory. It was being preserved. The lens of a cell phone, propped up inconspicuously, was drinking in every photon of light, every wave of sound, holding the stillness of Elijah against the hysteria of the accusation. This video would become the shield that paper reports could not penetrate. It would be the difference between a juvenile record and a vindication. As we dive into this story, we must understand that the hook here isn't the police arrival itself, but the terrifying calmness of the boy waiting for them. It is a calmness born of trauma, a stillness practiced in front of mirrors, a defense mechanism against a world that is terrified of your existence. This is how a Tuesday morning math class becomes a crime scene without a crime. The linoleum floor of the administrative hallway smelled of lemon cleaner and unspoken accusations, a sharp chemical scent that burns the nostrils and signals the sterile authority of the institution. Elijah sat on a hard plastic chair outside the principal's office, his hands folded neatly in his lap, mimicking a composure he did not feel but knew he was required to project. To the casual observer walking past, perhaps a student heading to the library or a custodian pushing a mop bucket, he looked simply like a boy waiting for a meeting. But internally, a complex and exhausting calculus was running at fever pitch, a mental algorithm that black children in America are taught to run before they are taught long division. This is the black tax. It is not a financial levy deducted from a paycheck, but a cognitive tariff extracted from the soul. It is the invisible labor of constantly managing the perceptions of others, of shrinking oneself to appear less threatening, of calibrating the tone of your voice to be audible but never aggressive. It is the exhausting reality of knowing that your stillness can be interpreted as defiance and your silence as a threat. While his classmates were allowed the luxury of unbridled adolescence, allowed to be loud, messy, and emotional, Elijah was paying the tax of hyper-awareness. He was calculating how his posture would look on a security camera and how his breathing might be described in a police report. This tension is the invisible current running beneath the floorboards of this entire story. To understand why a math teacher felt empowered to call law enforcement on a student who had not raised a fist or thrown a chair, we have to look at the narrative architecture that supports such a decision. The report that was being typed up behind the frosted glass of the office door used words like aggressive, disruptive, and out of control. These are not just adjectives, they are weapons. They are the standard vocabulary used to criminalize the existence of black boys in educational spaces. But Elijah had anticipated this weaponization. He understood that in a battle of words between a credentialed adult and a minority student, the student's truth is often treated as fiction until proven otherwise. This is why the phone in his pocket, now warm against his thigh, was the most important object in the building. It was not just a device for communication, it was an insurance policy against the erasure of his reality. He knew that without the digital receipt of the encounter, his life could be derailed by the whims of an authority figure who felt disrespected by his autonomy. The black tax demands that you not only survive the incident but that you also document it, because your survival is not assumed to be a right, but a privilege that can be revoked. As the clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness, marking the minutes until the police would arrive, 3 distinct lessons coalesced in Elijah's mind, lessons that we will unpack as we move deeper into this investigation. These are the pillars of his defense, the open loops that will guide us through the absurdity of this Tuesday morning. First, we will see the defense of excellence, the way Elijah used his academic standing not as a boast, but as a shield, proving that he belonged in that room more than the bias against him did. Second, we will witness the mastery of code switching, the ability to navigate 2 linguistic worlds simultaneously, speaking the language of the street for survival and the language of the institution for protection. And finally, we will arrive at the receipts, the undeniable logical win provided by that cell phone recording. These 3 elements, excellence, adaptation, and evidence, were the only things standing between Elijah and the juvenile justice system. He was not just waiting for the police. He was preparing a closing argument for a trial that had begun the moment he walked into the classroom. To the secretary answering phones a few feet away, the silence from the boy in the chair was unremarkable. She did not hear the thunderous noise of a life being weighed in the balance. She did not see the history of generations pressing down on his shoulders, whispering warnings about how to keep his hands visible and his eyes lowered. The tension in this hallway was thick enough to choke on, yet it was entirely invisible to those who do not have to pay the tax. The official story was already being solidified in the computer system. A dangerous teen, a frightened teacher, a necessary intervention. But the truth was sitting quietly in a plastic chair, holding a digital file that would shatter that lie into 1,000 pieces. The police were coming to arrest a caricature, a monster invented by bias, but they would find only a boy who had mastered the art of stillness in the center of a storm. This disconnect between the reported chaos and the recorded calm is where the true horror of this story lies. It forces us to ask not what Elijah did wrong, but why his mere presence was so terrifying that it required the intervention of the state. The air conditioning vent above the principal's waiting area rattled with a persistent, rhythmic clatter that seemed to count down the seconds until the inevitable collision of two worlds. Elijah sat directly beneath it, the cold draft hitting the back of his neck, but he did not shift, he did not shiver, and he certainly did not complain. To the casual observer, he was simply a student waiting for a meeting, but inside the fortress of his mind, he was executing a high-level survival algorithm known to many but spoken of by few. This was the defense of excellence in real-time application. It is a strategy born not of ambition, but of necessity, a generational inheritance passed down from fathers to sons in living rooms and barbershops across the nation. The core tenet is simple yet suffocating. In any interaction with authority, you must display a level of composure that borders on the supernatural, because your baseline humanity is often interpreted as aggression. Elijah knew that his posture had to be mathematically precise. If he slouched, he was disrespectful. If he sat too upright, he was posturing. If he looked at the floor, he was guilty. If he made direct eye contact, he was defiant. He had to inhabit a narrow, impossible sliver of existence where he was present enough to be acknowledged, but submissive enough to be deemed safe. This is the exhaustion of the defense of excellence. It is the requirement to be a diplomat, a legal scholar, and a Zen master while merely trying to exist in a public school hallway. Across from him, or rather, pacing frantically around the periphery of his stillness, was the source of the chaos. The teacher's voice was a jagged serration cutting through the hum of the office. She was narrating a version of reality that was rapidly diverging from the truth, constructing a story of danger and insubordination. She spoke of feeling threatened, of aggressive tones, of a classroom spiraling out of control. Yet, the physical evidence in the room told a completely inverted story. She was the one with the flushed face and the elevated heart rate. She was the one occupying space with frantic energy, waving her hands, her voice cracking with the stress of her own fabrication. Elijah, by contrast, was a statue carved from obsidian. He had learned early that in the theater of bias, the black body is weaponized by default. To neutralize that weaponization, he had to strip himself of all reaction. He had to eviscerate his own emotional response. He could feel the indignation rising in his chest, a hot, expanding gas that demanded release, but he swallowed it down, forcing it into the pit of his stomach. This was the price of the ticket. To react was to confirm the lie. To speak up was to validate the fear. He watched her moving near the reception desk, explaining the situation to the secretary with breathless urgency. It was a masterclass in projection. The chaos she claimed to be fleeing was actually emanating from her own internal landscape, but she was projecting it onto the silent boy in the plastic chair. This is the paradox of the black tax in educational spaces. The student is often expected to manage the emotional regulation of the adult. Elijah was effectively parenting his own teacher by refusing to feed into her hysteria. He was holding the emotional center of the room because the person paid to do so had abdicated that responsibility in favor of fear. He realized then that excellence, in this context, was not about academic performance or athletic prowess. Excellence was the ability to remain the calmest person in the room when everyone else has decided you are the storm. It was a defensive excellence, a shield made of silence and strict adherence to a code of conduct that his accuser had long since abandoned. His hand rested on his thigh, dangerously close to his pocket, and he made the calculated decision to retrieve his phone. He moved with the slowness of a bomb disposal technician. Every inch was deliberate. He knew that a sudden movement could be retroactively described as reaching for a weapon, or at the very least, an act of overt defiance. He slid the device out, keeping it low, shielding the screen with his body. He wasn't checking social media or texting a friend, he was activating the only witness he could trust. He pressed the record button. This was not an act of rebellion, as the school administration would later claim. It was the ultimate act of the defense of excellence. It was the introduction of objective reality into a subjective nightmare. By recording, he was creating a receipt for a transaction he never asked to be part of. He set the phone face down on his knee, the microphone open to the room, capturing the disparity between the teacher's frantic accusations and the room's deafening quiet. The heavy oak door at the end of the hallway swung open, the hinges groaning under the weight. 2 police officers stepped into the administrative block, their utility belts creaking with the equipment of state force. They scanned the room, looking for the monster they had been dispatched to subdue. They had been told of a disturbance, a volatile situation, a male subject out of control. Their eyes swept over the frantic teacher, the nervous secretary, and finally landed on Elijah. He sat there, hands folded, breathing evenly, the recording device silently spinning a digital thread of truth on his knee. The officers paused, a flicker of confusion crossing the face of the lead deputy. The scene did not match the call. They were prepared for a physical confrontation, muscles tensed for a takedown, but instead, they were confronted with the immovable object of a boy who had mastered the art of not existing while being right there in front of them. The air in the small administrative office seemed to solidify as the heavy boots of the sheriff's deputies crossed the threshold, bringing with them the distinct, sharp scent of ozone and gun oil that seems to cling to law enforcement uniforms. Every molecule in the room appeared to freeze in anticipation of a collision that the dispatch call had promised, yet the scene before the officers defied the physics of the report they had received. Mrs. Gable turned toward them, her body language shifting instantly from the aggressive posture of an accuser to a performative frailty that sought to weaponize their arrival. She brought her hands to her chest, her breathing becoming audibly ragged, presenting herself as the besieged educator who had barely survived a chaotic uprising. It was a transformation so sudden and complete that it felt theatrical, a desperate attempt to manifest the danger she claimed existed but was visibly absent from the room. She began to speak, her voice pitching up an octave, the words tumbling out in a jagged stream about insubordination and feeling threatened, about a boy who simply would not listen, painting a verbal portrait of a hulking menace that needed to be contained. But the canvas she was painting on remained stubbornly blank. Elijah watched this transformation through half-lidded eyes, his internal machinery whirring into a higher gear of suppression, engaging the mechanism that is the absolute necessity for survival in his position. This was the internal volume knob, a psychological device he had been constructing and refining since he was old enough to understand why his mother gripped his hand tighter when a patrol car rolled past their bus stop. It is a discipline of the spirit, a way of turning down the gain on one's own humanity to avoid triggering the fears of others. Inside, his heart wanted to hammer against his ribs, the primal fight-or-flight response screaming at him to stand up, to shout, to defend his name against these wild fabrications being spun into the public record. He wanted to ask why his silence was being criminalized while her hysteria was being codified as truth. But he knew, with a wisdom far beyond his 16 years, that for a black boy in a room full of armed authority, emotion is a luxury he cannot afford. Anger is read as aggression, fear is read as guilt, confusion is read as resistance. So he reached for that internal dial and twisted it all the way to the left, muting the noise of his own soul until he became a vessel of absolute zero. He focused on the sensory details of the present moment to anchor himself, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the scuff mark on the linoleum floor, the rhythmic rise and fall of his own diaphragm. He practiced a form of code switching that goes deeper than language. He was code switching his very biology, forcing his pulse to slow and his muscles to slacken in the face of a predator. The lead deputy, a man with a thick neck and eyes that had seen too many domestic disputes to be easily swayed by theatrics, looked between the hyperventilating educator and the statue-still teenager. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, not on his weapon, but resting there in a habit of readiness that slowly began to relax. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. The dispatch had described a male subject out of control, a situation spiraling into violence, yet the only source of chaos in the room was the woman demanding the boy's arrest. Elijah sat with his hands visible, palms open on his knees, a posture of submission that was simultaneously a power move of profound defiance. By refusing to participate in the drama Mrs. Gable was directing, he was dismantling her script line by line. He was not the antagonist she needed him to be. He was a mirror, calm and polished, reflecting her own unraveling back at her and at the officers who stood watching. The phone on his knee continued its silent vigil, the recording app capturing not the sounds of a riot, but the sounds of a one-sided meltdown. It captured the shrill accusations hitting the wall of Elijah's silence and sliding off, leaving no mark. This was the essence of the internal volume knob. The understanding that when the world tries to amplify you into a monster, the most radical act of rebellion is to be so quiet that they are forced to hear themselves. The officers stepped further into the room, the tension shifting from a tactical threat assessment to a confused investigation. The lead deputy cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room, and asked a question that signaled the beginning of the end for the teacher's narrative. He didn't ask Elijah to stand up. He didn't ask Elijah to put his hands behind his back. He looked at the breathless teacher, his brow furrowed in genuine perplexity, and asked where the disturbance was. Elijah remained motionless, the volume of his existence turned down so low that his innocence became the loudest thing in the room. The silence in the classroom had a texture to it, a heavy and particulate quality that reminded Elijah not of a school detention, but of the front porch on a humid July evening 3 years prior. The air in the room was stale, recycled through vents clogged with decades of academic dust, yet in his mind, he was breathing in the sharp, grounding scent of menthol and cured tobacco. This was the sanctuary of his grandfather, a man whose spine had been stiffened by the Jim Crow South, and whose silence was not an absence of thought, but a reservoir of it. Elijah did not learn this supernatural stillness from a textbook or a behavioral therapist. He inherited it as one might inherit a pocket watch or a plot of land. It was the intergenerational link, the transfer of survival protocols from one era of peril to another. In the present moment, the teacher was vibrating with an erratic, frantic energy, her accusations tumbling out in a discordant rhythm, but Elijah was miles away, anchored in the memory of a lesson that was now saving his life. He remembered the creak of the wicker chair and the way the setting sun caught the deep grooves in his grandfather's face, a topography of endurance that commanded respect without uttering a syllable. The lesson that day had not been about mathematics or history, but about the physics of existence in a world that viewed their bodies as sites of potential conflict. His grandfather had called it the art of becoming invisible in plain sight, a paradoxical discipline where one asserts their humanity by refusing to offer the spectacle that power demands. The old man had explained that authority, when fragile and insecure, feeds on reaction. It craves the kinetic energy of resistance to justify its own crushing weight. If you push back, they have a reason to push you down. If you shout, they have a reason to silence you. But if you become a void, a calm surface that reflects their own chaos back at them, you short-circuit the machinery of their bias. Elijah sat at that desk, his hands clasped loosely, his breathing regulated to a slow, undetectable rhythm, channeling the spirit of a man who had walked past sheriffs and nightsticks with his head high and his mouth shut. This was the counterstory to the narrative of the wild, fatherless youth. The truth was that Elijah was the product of intense, rigorous fathering, a mentorship so deep and strategic that it functioned like military drilling. He had been trained for this exact moment since he was old enough to understand the difference between a question and an interrogation. The stillness was not passivity, it was active combat on a psychological battlefield. He was holding the line. Every muscle in his body wanted to tense up, to defend himself against the teacher's shrill lies, but the voice of his mentor whispered through the corridors of his memory, reminding him that his dignity was a fortress that could only be breached from the inside. As the police officer looked from the frantic teacher to the statue-like boy, a subtle shift occurred in the dynamic of the room, a recognition of an ancient frequency. The officer, a veteran of the streets who knew the smell of guilt and the erratic movements of danger, found himself disarmed by the boy's composure. This was the power of the receipts, not just the digital ones recording on the phone, but the cultural receipts paid for by generations of men who learned that to survive, they had to master the self completely. Elijah was displaying a level of executive control that most adults in that building could not summon. The teacher, in her attempt to paint him as a threat, had inadvertently highlighted his supreme discipline. She was the one pacing, her voice cracking, her finger pointing with tremors of adrenaline. She was the chaos she claimed to be reporting. Elijah was the order. The contrast was so stark it was almost architectural, a crumbling ruin of authority standing next to a sleek, modern obelisk of truth. The officer's confusion deepened, not because he didn't understand what he was seeing, but because it defied the script he had been handed by the dispatch radio. He was told there was a disturbance. He found a meditation. This disconnect was the direct result of the intergenerational link, the wisdom of the elders manifesting in the posture of the youth, proving that the greatest defense against a system designed to break you is to be already whole, unbreakable, and terrifyingly calm. The red recording indicator on the smartphone screen pulsed like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat, the only thing in the room that seemed alive with honest intent amidst the sterility of the classroom. While the teacher's voice jaggedly filled the frequency of the room with high-pitched accusations, the digital eye of the camera simply observed, stripping away the emotional veneer to capture the raw, unvarnished geometry of the situation. This was the era where the abstract concept of truth had been replaced by the binary reality of data, and in this specific coordinate of time and space, that data was accumulating in megabytes of silence. The officer who had stepped through the doorframe brought with him the heavy, utilitarian scent of polyester and tension, a smell that usually precipitates the metallic click of handcuffs. He had been primed by the dispatcher's voice, a voice that had translated the teacher's frantic call into a code that meant danger, aggression, and non-compliance. His hand hovered near his belt, not out of malice, but out of muscle memory and the drilled expectation of a threat. But as his gaze swept the room, the tactical map he had built in his mind began to dissolve into incoherence. Inside the mind of the officer, a cognitive dissonance began to grind like gears lacking oil. He looked at the teacher, Mrs. Gable, whose chest was heaving as if she had just run a marathon, her face flushed with the exertion of performing fear. She was pointing, gesturing, her words tumbling over one another in a cascade of buzzwords designed to trigger a law enforcement response. She used terms like threatening, insubordinate, and aggressive, words that carry the weight of legal justification for force. Then, the officer looked at Elijah. The boy was seated. His hands were not balled into fists but were resting flat on the desk, a posture of open submission that contradicted every syllable spilling from the educator's mouth. Elijah was not merely quiet. He was motionless, possessing a stillness so profound it felt practiced, a masterclass in de-escalation that no teenager should have to master. The officer found himself in a surreal predicament where the alleged perpetrator was the only source of calm in a chaotic environment. This is where the concept of receipts transcends the physical video file and becomes a phenomenon of moral accounting. The receipts were not just the pixels being saved to the cloud, they were the visible discrepancy between the reported event and the observed reality. The officer, trained to detect erratic behavior, found his internal radar pinging wildly, not at the black teenager, but at the middle-aged woman whose authority was disintegrating in real time. He watched her pace. He watched her eyes dart around the room, looking for allies that did not exist, looking for the validation of her fear. When she realized the officer was not immediately tackling the student, her performance shifted. She became louder, more insistent, her voice rising an octave as she tried to bridge the gap between her fabrication and the officer's hesitation. This is the extinction burst of a lie, the moment when a false narrative, realizing it is dying, expends all its energy in a final, desperate flare. The officer took a step forward, but not toward Elijah. He moved into the center of the room, effectively placing his body between the hysteria of the accuser and the dignity of the accused. Silence, in this context, was not the absence of sound, it was the loudest testimony in the room. Elijah's refusal to speak, his refusal to argue back or plead his innocence, forced the officer to rely solely on the visual evidence. Had Elijah shouted, had he stood up to defend himself, he would have provided the audio-visual cover the teacher needed to justify her panic. His voice would have merged with hers, creating a cacophony that the officer would have been forced to suppress. By withholding his reaction, Elijah created a vacuum that Mrs. Gable was forced to fill with her own instability. The recording on the desk captured this perfectly, the juxtaposition of a storm raging against a mountain. The officer finally spoke, his voice dropping to that practiced baritone of control, but the direction of his address had shifted. He did not issue a command to the student. He turned his back to Elijah, a tactical vulnerability he would never expose to a genuine threat, and faced the teacher. He asked her to step outside. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible maneuver, but in the language of power dynamics, it was a thunderclap. It was the moment the badge recognized that the danger in the room was not the boy sitting in the desk, but the woman standing at the whiteboard. The moral victory was cemented not by an arrest or a gavel, but by the look on the teacher's face as the realization washed over her. She had called for the sword of the state to strike down a perceived defiance, but the sword had turned to inspect the hand that wielded it. The recording continued to pulse, capturing the deflation of her posture. The video would later serve as the undeniable proof, the receipts that would circulate online and in administrative hearings, but the true receipt was printed in that very moment. It was the realization that her privilege, usually a currency accepted without question, had just been declined due to insufficient funds of truth. Elijah remained seated, breathing rhythmically, watching the red, knowing that he had won the war without ever firing a shot, simply by letting the enemy exhaust their ammunition against the armor of his silence. The late afternoon sun sliced through the blinds of the guidance counselor's office, illuminating the floating dust in a room that had finally run out of words. It was 3 days after the incident, a stretch of time that had felt less like hours passing and more like a slow, pressurized hold on the lungs of everyone involved. Elijah sat in the same chair he had occupied during previous disciplinary lectures, but the gravity in the room had shifted on its axis. The principal, a man whose career was built on the seamless management of adolescent chaos, sat with his hands clasped tightly on his desk, looking at a file that contained the official retraction of the suspension order. There was no shouting, no dramatic gavel strike, and no triumphant music swelling in the background. The end of the war was marked only by the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the shuffling of papers that legally acknowledged a mistake without fully admitting to the moral failure that caused it. This was the final lesson of the ordeal, the epilogue that they do not teach in civics class. Vindication is rarely a loud celebration, but rather a quiet exhaling of breath you didn't know you were holding. The teacher was not present. Her absence was a palpable entity in the room, a void shaped like accountability. She had been placed on administrative leave, a bureaucratic euphemism for being hidden away until the heat of the undeniable truth cooled down. Elijah looked at the empty chair next to the window where she usually sat during these interventions. He realized then that the system was scrambling not to comfort him, but to indemnify itself. The video he had captured had not just saved him from suspension, it had saved the school from a lawsuit that would have peeled back the layers of bias embedded in their disciplinary algorithms. The apology offered by the administration was sanitized and precise, constructed by lawyers rather than educators. They spoke of misunderstandings and procedural errors, carefully avoiding the words profiling or targeting. Elijah listened, nodding slowly, his face maintaining that same practiced mask of neutrality that had saved him in the hallway. He understood that even in victory, he had to be careful not to gloat, for an arrogant winner can quickly be recast as a villain in the sequel to the story. Later that evening, the solitude of his bedroom felt different. For years, this space had been a refuge from a world that viewed his growth spurts as threat assessments. Now, it felt like a command center that had successfully repelled a siege. He picked up his phone, the device that had transformed from a distraction into a shield. On the screen, the thumbnail of the video remained. He didn't play it. He didn't need to. He knew every frame by heart. He knew the exact timestamp where the teacher's voice cracked from authority into hysteria. He knew the moment where the officer's boots entered the frame, and the specific silence that followed when the visual evidence contradicted the verbal report. This digital artifact was his receipt. In the economy of racial dynamics, he had been asked to pay a tax of submission, to plead guilty to a crime of existence. But he had refused the transaction. By holding up the mirror of the camera, he forced the system to look at its own reflection, and the system had flinched. The psychological toll, however, remained unpaid. This is the hidden cost of the counter-narrative. To survive, Elijah had to suppress every natural human instinct to defend himself verbally, to shout back, to express frustration. He had to become a statue of stoicism while being accused of chaos. This emotional suppression is a heavy armor to wear, and taking it off takes longer than putting it on. He looked at his reflection in the dark window of his room. He saw a young man who had learned that his survival depended on his ability to curate reality better than the adults in charge. He had learned that the truth does not set you free. The proof of the truth sets you free. The truth without a recording is just an anecdote, easily dismissed by power. The truth with a recording is a weapon, one that cuts through the carefully woven tapestries of institutional lies. As the night deepened, the noise of the internet chatter regarding his exoneration faded into the background. People online were calling him a hero, a symbol of resistance, a genius of de-escalation. But he didn't feel like a symbol. He felt tired. He felt the exhaustion of someone who has to carry a body cam in his soul just to walk through a hallway. Yet, beneath the fatigue, there was a new, hardened foundation. He had looked into the eye of the storm, the combined authority of the school and the police, and he had not blinked. He had dismantled their story not with force, but with an aggressive stillness. He had proven that when the world screams that you are out of control, the most radical act of rebellion is to remain perfectly, undeniably in command of yourself. The final lesson was not that the system is broken, for he already knew that. The final lesson was that he was unbreakable. He placed the phone on the nightstand, the screen turning black, burying the evidence of the battle until it was needed again, and finally, for the first time in days, he closed his eyes and allowed himself to just be a child, sleeping in the safety of his own truth.